All right, Jill, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Super pumped to be with you.
Awesome. I want to jump right in and talk. I think the waters are a little bit muddy when it comes to sports nutrition versus nutrition. There's a lot of information out there, and I think people can get confused on what the difference is. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of number one, what led you to pursuing sports nutrition, and if there's a difference, like if you think there's a difference at all between sport nutrition and just regular good nutrition.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first, maybe just a little bit about me. So, I spent about 20 years as a high level student athlete. Soccer was my sport of choice. And then I've been in the industry for 20 years as a coach and a consultant. And I do what I do as a coach and consultant because I didn't know it when I was a student athlete. So, by the time I learned how to take care of my wellness and performance and recovery from a nutrition standpoint, my career was over. And I still played at a pretty high level, was blessed to be able to go to school in the States on a Division I soccer scholarship. However, my health when I wasn't competing wasn't great. And it took me about a decade to kind of get my metabolism and everything back in order after my soccer career was over. And so I'm just very passionate about making sure that athletes, I personally believe in my business that an athlete can only perform well over time at an elite level if they are physically and mentally and spiritually well first. And so my integrative sports nutrition training, which is how I was trained in nutrition 20 years ago, is what, this is how I approach performance nutrition. And it's the approach I've been taking for 15 plus years. So I do what I do because I didn't know the nutrition part of it when I was an athlete. I spend most of my time being a champion of people and helping them fuel performance. And I didn't know how to fuel my performance, and neither did my parents for that matter back in the day. And the one thing though that I did know, which is really a key part of the business that I operate now, is how to champion people because I had so many people along the way as a student athlete and still do in my business career who champion me. And so that's a big component of what I do. And I think as we talk for the rest of the podcast, you'll see how those two things are very connected.
Right. No, I love that. It's I love the coming from the area of just like championing people. Because I think anyone who gets into this industry and gets into nutrition or gets into sport performance or anything is either they came from an athletic background themselves or they want to help people pursue the dreams that maybe they didn't get to. And I love that answer. I want to take kind of this is going to be a bit of a vague question, but I think a lot of athletes, you see a lot of athletes on a daily basis, and I'm interested to know what you think. And I'm sure there's a plethora of things that they miss the mark on, but what are the things that you see most commonly that athletes are missing the mark on when it comes to nutrition in general?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the first thing, which is going to be not nutrition related, is just being very crystal clear on what your acute goals are. Because without really understanding for the next 90 days or the next off season or the current season that you're in, what it is you're trying to accomplish, if you don't understand that, or your performance team at the team you're at doesn't understand, or the parents of the student athlete don't understand it, the strength coach that you're working with doesn't understand it, then all of the choices and confusion and the things you're trying to learn won't match up with achieving your goals. So the first thing I do with the people I work with, whether it's teaching a business how to do what I do or working one-on-one with a student athlete family or a pro or elite athlete, is get very crystal clear on what our goals are for the next 90 days or 6 months. Once that's established, then I think, and this is really a broad answer, but it's really no matter, again, if it's a business or a student athlete or a pro athlete, most people aren't clear on how, what foods to eat, eating enough high quality foods at the right time. And I would argue, you asked earlier if there's a difference between performance nutrition and regular nutrition. And there's really no difference per se when it comes to like the quality of the food and paying attention to timing of when you eat. The biggest difference between the two is just volume. It's kind of the same thing with strength and conditioning. The biggest difference between a general population person and an athlete is really usually the volume and intensity of the training, to be quite honest. And food is a little different. Athletes generally, if I'm going to say, just a general broad brush comment, need more food, and they need to make sure it's of high quality. So most athletes miss the mark on just understanding what their real acute goals are, or just making sure that everybody around them knows what those things are. And then making sure that the food they choose is of a high quality in the right amount at the right time.
Right. No, I love that. And I think that's important that you mentioned goals, because I see it in the strength and conditioning realm all the time that like an athlete will come to me and they just like they haven't defined we can't do 10 things at once. Like let's define a goal and let's go after that goal, because it's going to allow us to be on the same page and it's going to allow me to really dial things into what we're trying to achieve. You mentioned in there a couple times, and I have a twofold question here. You mentioned 90 days to 6 months. I know in strength and conditioning, and I'm going to bring that parallel in a lot because that's really the world that I understand. But in strength and conditioning, we like I see people flip flop a lot, right? They'll try something for a week, it doesn't work, and then they're on to something else. And you really need the consistency over time to see if anything actually moved the needle, right? So you said 90 days to 6 months in there a couple times. Do you recommend that someone, if they're implementing a new diet or they're implementing new foods, they stick to it for at least 90 days? And then the second part to that question was the high quality foods, because I think there's levels to high quality. Like you have like junk food versus just regular old whole foods, like eating a cheeseburger versus cooking a cheeseburger at home with ground beef. And then there's the, grain fed versus grass fed. So you can go into the organic realm. And so there's qualities within quality. So the two-part question is, how long should an athlete stick to a diet? And then what do you mean by quality foods?
Yeah, so just so we're using the same verbiage, athletes don't diet, they fuel for performance. So I'm
Okay.
actually really intentional about the type of language that I use, because diets are for the diet culture. And that's what's confusing everybody in performance. When I was a student athlete, there was no social media or anything like that. So not knowing how to fuel was just out of pure ignorance. There just wasn't
Right.
access to information. There certainly wasn't any research on it. And the female athlete triad was like just something that was coming out then. And
Right.
the impact of low energy availability on our ability to train and be well. So today the issue is there's still confusion, there's still people don't know what to do, but it's because there's too much information coming at us, and it's mostly from social media and diet culture. And so athletes of all levels, of all sport, both genders, are completely confused because of what they're seeing on social media all the time. So just like strength and conditioning, nutrition can and really should be periodized. Now, how long the periodization is for just depends on the goal. That's why I always start with understanding what your athlete's or your personal goal is. It could be 2 weeks because you had an injury. It could be 6 weeks. It could be 90 days. It could be a whole season, 6 months roughly. So again, it's just really goal related. I'd say there's probably some basic tenets that whether you're general population or an athlete in any part of the season, like protein intake and hydration, that are, something we all could be doing regardless. But how long someone is on a certain set program is dependent upon, again, their goals and what they're trying to achieve. And if there's something specific like extra healing from an injury, like I mentioned, or a specific need that we need to acutely address. So there's really no set time per se. Like I said, there are basic tenets that I think stay steady throughout the majority of a year or of a season. But the length by which someone might be doing some specific, using food as a tool to accomplish a specific goal or goals, again, depends on what those goals are and where we are in the macro cycle of the year.
Right. No, that's a great answer. I think, yeah, if you said it in there with the social media, there's so much information out there and athletes can really get a hold of anything they want. And I think there's so many different people pushing nutrition, and I think athletes are starting to understand the importance. And I'm not necessarily in the nutrition world, so I don't know if there is a disconnect with athletes. But from my perspective, nutrition is one of the more important aspects of fueling performance, right? If you can go in the gym and train as hard as you want. If you're not fueling afterwards, you're not going to grow. If that's your goal, you're definitely not going to recover. And I think athletes see the importance in going in and training really hard every day, but they don't see the importance in getting high quality nutrition in or just getting regular good nutrition in. Why, in your opinion, I guess this is an opinion based question, why do you think the importance of nutrition, given it is so important to sport performance, why are athletes not necessarily taking it seriously or giving it the importance that training gets?
I think it's because it's hard. So if you think about training and practice and all that, you go for 1 hour, someone tells you what to do, you execute and you leave. Or you might go 2 hours a day or three. I mean, you could spend that, any athlete could spend between 1 and 4 hours training per day. But in a 24-hour day, if between 1 and 4 hours dedicated to training, The rest is dedicated to all the rest of the things you do to take care of your body. And nutrition takes up a huge component of that, especially when most of the student athletes I work with should be eating like 5 or 6 times a day. Most of my elite level athletes are eating between 4 and 6 times a day. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of forethought, a lot of preparation, which isn't easy in the beginning. It gets easier the more you get into it. But I think initially, the reason why it might not be getting the respect or the attention that it deserves is because it's hard and there's a learning curve initially. But once you get over that hump, it really is kind of like a downhill ride because it becomes more second nature. I think the second thing has to do with what we were talking about is just confusing. And so there's a saying that says the confused mind says no. So if you're not sure who to follow, you're not sure what's right, you just stay confused. And then the third thing I think is that many athletes don't initially feel like they have to pay attention to nutrition because they're really gifted. They can just go to practice, do their extra skills work, maybe slip on some compression boots, and they get away with it. They get away with playing at a decent level. But at some point, especially as you move through the collegiate ranks and into any pro sports, I mean, I would even say in some of the higher level student athlete club sports these days, everybody is doing skill work, compression boots, and practice. And so then what starts to differentiate you is the other things you do, your fueling, how well you sleep and rest. And then what wakes people up sometimes in that realm is if they start to have other health challenges, because again, nutrition is a huge component of us just being well. And as I mentioned before, athletes who want to compete at an elite level over time must first be well. And so sometimes what wakes people up is that they just become unwell. They start to have digestive issues, mental health issues, sleep issues, about hormone issues. And so then they're almost forced to start to pay attention to the nutrition. So my goal, especially with the work I do with student athletes, because nutrition is such a huge component of growth and development, and the caloric need is really high. I teach a lot on something called REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. My goal is just to bring people's awareness to higher quality food at the right time and the right amount so that we can avoid being unwell and we can get the most out of our athletic career and stay in our sport as long as we choose to.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. And I think you hit the nail on the head with it just being hard. I had never taken into consideration that nutrition is like your whole day, right? Like you say, you come see me for an hour and we train and I give you the plan and you just execute. But with nutrition, if you don't have a coach, it's all on you. And there's so much, like even for myself, I fall off the wagon sometimes with meal preparation because it's just so intensive, like every Sunday making meals for the whole week. And if I don't get to it on Sunday, then my whole schedule gets messed up and it just becomes that snowball effect that just gets hard to stay on top of. And especially if you're a student athlete, you don't have the resources, maybe you don't have the funds, you went out with your friends on Saturday and Sunday meal prep didn't get done. So I think that's a great point. I think leading off of that, being a student athlete, I work with a lot of collegiate athletes, a lot of junior players who are around that 18 to 20 range, who might not have access to a nutritionist like yourself or have access to hire, or the funds, I guess, to hire a coach. What is a good entry point for those athletes to make sure that they're dialing in their nutrition without actually hiring a coach? Like, how can they get started with this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing is to know what your goals are, like know why you're doing it. Because again, we've already talked about this, but when you understand why you're doing something, it should cause you to have a bit more motivation or dedication to it. So it could be sports related metrics, strength, speed. Maybe you're trying to get more minutes on the team that you're on. Maybe you're trying to heal an injury. Just, put some context to the reason why, so that you have a driving force for those moments when you feel like you don't want to make the right choice or you don't want to go to get the stuff to meal prep. And by the way, nutrition, like anything else, is more about consistency. It's not about being perfect. And so there's still a lot of diet culture influences around that in performance nutrition, that if you forget to have your protein shake after your training, your hamstring is going to fall off and it completely negates your whole training session. That's not really how it works. But that's diet culture's, in my opinion, influence on performance nutrition. We're so afraid to make a mistake. And everybody's going to make a mistake. Everybody's going to choose to go out and have pizza or something with some friends or teammates from time to time. It's just about consistency. And athletes get this. You practice a skill, you practice a move, you practice things over and over to get better at them. And it's not always perfect when you practice them, but that's why you do it. And so nutrition should be looked at the same way. It's not going to be perfect. The only time I'm like tighter on my athletes is when we have a time constraint. If I have a short off season, if I have a short bit of time that we have to get them well to get them back on the ice or on the court or in the pool from an injury before the next person takes their spot, we're going to be a little tighter in making sure that we're close to perfect. But again, even in that sense, we're just aiming for consistency. So the first is to know your why. And the second is to make sure you have the skills to do it. I talk with a lot of student athletes and a lot of pro athletes that don't know how to cook. Like it sounds great for me to tell them to go buy chicken, go buy vegetables, go buy, grass-fed beef, all this stuff, but they don't know what to do with it when they get it home. And so sometimes even for me, I've been in this industry 20 years, I forget, I need to ask, like, do you know how to do you own a blender? Do you know how to make a protein shake? Do you, what do you have, a toaster oven? Like, what kind of tools do you have where you're staying to actually make the food? So that's where I kind of joke with especially my younger athletes, like high school and collegiate level, like use the internet for good. This is one way where social media and the internet will be your friend. Like Google 6 ways to make chicken and roasted vegetables. And you can find videos to learn how to make fish and properly cook a steak. Like teach yourself, because that's a lifelong skill that you'll use forever and ever and ever. Might get you a hot date in the future if you know how to make a great meal. And so, just use that. I was, with some guys getting ready for the NFL draft earlier this week. And that was something I talked to them about. I'm like, don't be embarrassed to admit if you don't know how to cook, just do something about it, like admit it and then do something about it. So in a month, you can be an amazing chef. So know why you're doing it. Make sure you have the skills to do it, because a lot of people, again, they don't know how. And then after that, it's just some low hanging fruit is something you mentioned earlier. It's like, if you feel like the food you're living off of comes through a drive through or is in tons of boxes and bags, let's just start to upgrade. I don't love the term whole foods because I don't think a lot of people, again, even know what that means, but let's eat stuff closer to the source, like fresh fruit, vegetables, rice, beans, fresh meats. Like, let's get closer to the source of some items, knowing that from time to time, we may need some packaged foods to layer some things in there. And so it's a learning curve. It doesn't happen overnight. You can't take an F diet to an A overnight. You're just slowly working on upgrading your choices over time. And the approach I really take is to add before you take away. And so I might not love that my student athletes, especially, or even sometimes the pros, are eating a ton of fast food or drinking a ton of soda, or they have like an aggressive sweet tooth. I might not love that, but before I tell them, you can't have those things because they're bad for inflammation or this, that, or the other, whatever, they might think, I'm first going to add what I can see glaringly after they give me like a food log is missing. And oftentimes it's protein throughout the day, lots of different colorful plants, and then hydration. And then usually we just spend time upgrading carbohydrate and performance fat sources. And once we lock that in, then we can tinker with timing and, get it a little more robust to their goals. But first we just have to add what's missing. So know your why, make sure you have some skills in the kitchen, and then just start adding what's missing from whole foods or foods closer kind of to their origin.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And to your point, there's really, with the internet now, there's really no excuse to not saying I don't know how to cook, unless you don't, like you say, you don't have the blender or whatever. Go buy one. It's $20 at Walmart. But with the internet now, there's really no excuse. You can make delicious meals that are also aligned with your nutrition goals. And I love the point that you made about consistency. And I wholeheartedly agree with that, because it's the exact same. I think it's the exact same in any facet of your life, especially in sport performance. Consistency over time is what leads to great results, right? And I always tell my athletes that occasionally good is better than, or consistently good is better than occasionally great, right? It's better to have 5 okay workouts that week than to have 1 good workout and 4 shit workouts. And it just, consistency over time will get you to where you want to be. And I have this conversation all the time. What I took from what you just said was, the fundamentals will never steer you wrong, right? And I think this applies more in nutrition than it does in performance. I had this conversation with our guest last week where we were talking about sport performance and how there's so much information and there's so many experts and so many gurus that every once in a while it's like these concentric circles, and we are drifting upwards overall. We're trending upwards as a kind of performance realm, but we start to drift away. There's this new fad diet, or there's this new supplement that you should take, and we get a little bit further from the fundamentals, but then they always circle back, and we always come back to the fundamentals. And they will always, if you can boil things down to the fundamentals, be consistent over time, you'll get the results you're looking for. Those are the two ingredients to almost anything in your life. So I love that answer. I want to get into a little bit of nuts and bolts about actual nutrition, timing of nutrition, and like pregame, intragame nutrition. So hockey is a bit of I call it an old boys club, because there's a lot of information that's been around from the 90s that people still stick to. And one of those things is, two of those things, I guess, are pregame meals and pregame naps. Pregame naps aren't going anywhere, but pregame meals, I think there's this misconception, and correct me if I'm wrong, my basic understanding of nutrition is that if we're going to carb load, eating a plate of pasta before I go do something isn't necessarily carb loading my body. We have to kind of do that a couple days in advance to kind of get that glycogen buildup. Am I correct to say that?
So in my business, we have what's called the 48-hour rule. If you have a game, let's say Saturday night, then we start preparing for Saturday night, Thursday morning. And so I think, the pregame meal has been around for all sports forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. When I was playing soccer, the team would go out the night before to an Italian place, and we would all have pasta, right? And that's what we did. But we start preparing, I call it the 48-hour rule. And it's because we're not just preparing the body fueling wise, we're just being mindful and a bit more intentional about everything: our hydration, our rest, and even who we hang around, what we watch on TV, the music that we listen to, just everything. I try to teach my athletes just to be a bit more mindful for the couple days leading up to competition, because everything that you take in, not just your food, can have an influence on that game. Now, we don't want it to be so hamstrung, and this is a little bit of a divergent, but I think it applies here. We don't want to be so hamstrung that if we wake up the day of the game and our HRV, whoop strap says we slept and we can't play. Like, we don't want to be so locked into everything we do in those 48 hours that if something goes just a little askew, we can't step on the ice and perform. But what I'm trying to say is, I'm just trying to wake people up to the fact that if you're waiting to the pregame meal to get your act together to perform well, it's oftentimes too late. If you've been sleeping poorly, eating like crap, not drinking enough, overtrained or undertrained, or didn't do your mobility work, or whatever you're supposed to be doing, and you just are going to, show up, that might work for some guys, like I mentioned earlier, who are gifted and talented for a minute, but then everybody else will catch up and surpass them if they don't change their ways. So to your point, glycogen, we can store quite a fair amount of glycogen in our body. And depending on our activity leading up to an event, whether it's training or practice, competition, a meet, we're using that energy. So how or if you need to carb load just depends on what the activity looked like the day of and the day before and 2 days before that event. So with my athletes, if they've been adequately fueling and following what I teach, they shouldn't be completely devoid of their muscle glycogen. So we're just using the pregame meal or the 2 meals leading up as a top off, if you will. It's like having a tank that's half or 3/4 full of gas in your car, and you're just going to fill it up just that little bit more because you had a light practice the day before, you had, some skate around, some warm up, and you're just going to use the pregame meal or a little bit of sports drink before you get on the ice for the game start to just top off, to make sure that your tank is completely primed and as fully primed as possible to execute as you know how to. So there's nothing wrong with having carbohydrates, and there should be carbohydrates in the meals leading up to most sports, especially team sports where you're, soccer and basketball and hockey, where you're going to be expending a lot of energy, or it's going to be an intense bout of energy. But it's not the only macronutrient you need, and we shouldn't be waiting until that one meal to get our act together from a performance nutrition standpoint.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And like you say, if you're waiting to that point, it's a little bit too late. And I think in my experience, a lot of hockey players, especially like I say, I work with a lot of younger guys, they're stuck in this like dogma that pregame pasta, and it's all about the pasta. But personally, for me, I when I played hockey, I hated like pregame pasta. It just made me feel heavy, and it made me not feel ready to play. But I love that 48-hour rule, and I love the analogy of you're just topping up that gas tank. So like you should be preparing a couple days in advance, and then you top that gas tank up. You mentioned pregame carbs should be included for someone like myself. So if I was you're consulting with you, I don't like this pregame pasta. I personally like something a little bit lighter, like a shake or something. What are you recommending to those athletes? And I guess it's a little bit individual to what works for the athlete. But what are you recommending as a whole to a hockey athlete pregame, and how soon before the game should they be consuming those nutrients?
Well, to your point, what an athlete eats before competition is completely dependent on them. I have some people who get such nervous butterflies and nervous energy that their digestive tract is kind of wrecked the day of competition just due to nerves and just how they prepare and kind of, the adrenaline and excitement they get leading up to games. And so we have to take all of that into consideration. And it doesn't have to come carbohydrates in the form of pasta, to your point. Some people might just be, hey, instead of getting the fettuccine Alfredo with all that sauce and stuff, maybe you just need to get like a light red sauce and have some meat in it. So sometimes it's just changing like the sauce on something like that. Sometimes we just have to go to rice, like plain white rice or potato. Or for some people, like yourself, you could do a shake and maybe it just has like a banana in it. Or maybe you're fine. Maybe the carbohydrates you had the day before are just enough and you feel good. Like you said, just having something, you need some calories in your system, but you love just like a shake and the way that feels, and you feel like you perform well on that. And then you'll just eat a solid meal afterwards that has the right ratio of carbohydrates and protein. So the pregame, there's a general like, hey, here's a suggestion. It's usually some combination of protein and carbohydrate. But that's where it's going to be a bit individual because everybody's got a little bit of a different nervous energy or excitement before a game. And so because of that, that actually impacts our digestive capabilities and how well we digest food and what sits well with us. So people kind of have to try things on. I generally try to teach people not to try anything new on game day. If we're going to try, a carbohydrate before game. So say pregame meal is 2 to 3 hours beforehand. That's a normal kind of zone. And sometime within the hour, depending on what warm-up looked like, how intense warm-up was, how long it was, some athletes feel like they need a little top off. That's where sports drinks have a place. I'm not a big sports drink fan, but there are a couple key places where I do think they have a place. So a couple gulps of a sports drink or half a banana, if that sits well in digestion, or an applesauce squeeze in the 60 minutes ish for some athletes is great. Others are fine, but you have to practice that during the week when you have practice. And I can eat a half a banana and not feel like I have to poop my pants at the first intermission, or I don't get sick to my stomach, 15 minutes in, because everybody's different. Some people can only drink blue Gatorade, and some people can't drink any sports drinks. I couldn't drink any sports drinks. It made me feel like I was gonna poop my pants. I later learned that it was totally just due to the fact that I was already dehydrated, and it just was creating too much of an osmotic effect in my digestive tract. But that was after my career was over, so I just had to only drink water. I could not touch a sports drink unless I was just completely desperate and training in the heat or playing in the heat. So you have to learn those things, and you practice that like anything else during the week so you know what to do on game day.
That's a great point, and I think that's important for athletes to understand that you don't mess with game day. Test it out beforehand, because the last thing you want is to be jeopardizing your gameplay. And because I get the question all the time from athletes, what should I be doing pregame, or how do I warm up? And to me, like I always have the saying, like, let athletes athlete. On game day, it's not my job to get in your way. On game day, it's my job to facilitate your performance. So if in my heart of hearts, I know that taping your knee doesn't do shit for your knee stability, but it makes you feel ready to play the game, then I'm going to tape your knee, right? Because that's how you prepare for the game. So similar in that if, eating a big plate of pasta helps you feel ready to play the game, then eat that big plate of pasta, right? It's all about, it's kind of a psychological thing too. I want to talk a little bit about intra-game nutrition. So should athletes be trying to fuel, and again, it's individual to the athlete, do you recommend that athletes try to fuel mid-game or like intermissions and that sort of stuff? And if you do, what sort of things are you recommending?
So that's really sport specific. It depends on the sport and the amount of minutes that you get, right? If I have an NBA client that's only playing a handful of minutes, chances are he doesn't need fuel during the game. If I have a soccer player that's playing 2 full halves, 2 45-minute, they're an outside midfielder in soccer at a high level of eliteness and competition can run anywhere between like 6 and 10 miles in a game. And so if that's the case, like absolutely at halftime, you're needing carbohydrates because
Mhm.
that stored glycogen is being depleted for the most part, based on what we know about the literature and how much we store in the muscle and how long it takes to deplete it. And so it's going to be sport specific. It's going to be how intense and how long you competed. And again, what did your prep look like? If you didn't eat enough leading up to it, then you might at intermission from hockey, even though, your line might have not been on very long, you need to have something because
Mhm.
you just weren't able to get enough in. So it's dependent upon all of those factors. And again, I kind of go back to some people just, even though they might need something, they might just have such a nervous stomach and their adrenaline and that how that impacts digestion sometimes prevents them. So we do go to some electrolyte beverages oftentimes intra game. I find for most people, most athletes who take in something in a team sport during games are usually doing electrolyte powders and water or some version of a sports drink that may have some carbohydrate in it. Sometimes people just need electrolytes. They don't need the carbohydrates. If they're a heavy sweater, they wear a lot of gear, they need the electrolytes almost more than the carbohydrates. And some need the carbohydrates because they've already spent a lot of energy and they want to make sure they have enough in the tank to finish out the rest of the game. And I've had some athletes, in the NFL, there's and even in the NBA, there's, a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches going around. And so again, it's very dependent. I know that doesn't answer your question specifically, but it's going to depend on what you did before, how many minutes you're playing, how intense were those minutes, and what it is that you personally need. Like, again, are you a heavy sweater? What's happening with you individually that might dictate what it is that you need to get to the end of the match or the game.
Right. No, and to your credit, I think that was a hard question to answer, both of those, because they're very individual. But I love to hear that like NBA guys are ripping peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, because I think for whatever reason in sport performance, there's this like allure around professional athletes that they're like these different people and they don't just eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich at halftime. And it's like they have all this high tech stuff, and it's like sometimes no, like they're people, right? Sometimes they're just ripping a PB&J sandwich, and that's okay for you to do too, right? If it makes you feel ready to play.
Yeah,
You talked about.
let me give a shout out really quick. So a few years ago, I did some research for an ESPN writer, a colleague of mine. His name is Baxter Holmes, Holmes. He actually won like a Pulitzer Prize for this article about and the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the NBA. And it's a really great article. And I helped him with some recon on the back end. And it's a fun read, but it got a lot of press. And it just speaks to, we love whole foods, and there's a place for things like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so I would encourage everybody to do, you can Google it, Baxter Holmes, like peanut butter and jelly, or NBA peanut butter and jelly, and I guarantee the article will come up. It's a great read.
Awesome. I'll make sure I link that for people to read down in the show notes. I'm going to go read it after we're done here. You mentioned previously about electrolytes and people being heavy sweaters. I do like an Instagram poll every week on my Instagram. And without a doubt, every week I get a question from a hockey player that says they cramp every time they're
Mm.
playing their sport, right? And my basic understanding of cramping is that you're also losing electrolytes, mainly sodium, when you're sweating, right? And so you need to replenish those things, or else you're not going to draw that water kind of into your
Mhm.
cell.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you're familiar with hockey at all. I always point to this example of Mark Scheifele, played for the Winnipeg Jets, plays for Winnipeg, and there's a few years ago there was like this thing going around where he was like ripping mustard packets on the bench just to get some
Mm.
sodium into him. And
Mm.
so I always kind of point to that of like you need to be replacing not only with water but with electrolytes. So I want to get your take on like why and how cramps are happening intra game, and then how athletes can deal with that and make sure that that's not happening.
Yeah, mustard packets. That's interesting. Yeah, so cramps, if you really look into the physiology of cramping, it's not all just from having an electrolyte imbalance or deficiency. There's actually a neuromuscular component to it, a neuromuscular fatigue component to it. And so there's an aspect of training that potentially could influence someone's cramping. So I always want to make sure that that's not it. If an athlete is cramping initially or towards the end of it, an activity, we again just have to make sure that their training has prepared them from a neuromuscular standpoint to do all the things they need to do in their sport. So we don't always just want to throw cramping into the dehydration component. We do want to make sure that neuromuscular fatigue and all of that conditioning is also potentially addressed for someone, especially that is a cramper all the time. But we do want to take into account electrolytes, and sodium chloride is like the number one electrolyte we lose in sweat. We also lose potassium and magnesium and some of the other trace minerals. And most people aren't getting enough electrolytes in their day-to-day, intake of food or beverages. And so I think that as a whole, athletes should be intentionally like using high quality salt. In the States, I like Redmond sea salt, like some high quality Himalayan or high quality salt on their whole food. So if you cook broccoli, you cook this chicken, you should be salting things so that generally you're getting that in every day, because water alone doesn't rehydrate us, like you mentioned. It's the fluid that our body is predominantly made of, but in order for that fluid to stick to us, if you will, we need electrolytes. They control the flux of fluid in and out of different cellular compartments and organs. And so it's like electrolytes are like the charge of our battery. We need them to help with muscle contraction and all sorts of other things. And so when they are askew, then that cramping happens. There's some, muscular contraction, electrical issues, if you will. And so back to the previous question, you have to know kind of what kind of a sweater you are. Some guys don't sweat much and some sweat a ton. Hockey, you're wearing a ton of gear, even though you're on the ice. I think people have this misnomer because it's not out. So it's not like football outside in Texas in the summer where you would know and everybody's looking for dehydration and heavy sweating because it's in a cooler environment. Sometimes I think it's a afterthought. But you sweat a lot. And if you're not sure how much you sweat, and I encourage all my athletes to do this, I say a couple times over a period of a couple weeks, weigh yourself in. And football has always really been good with this. But I think just due to what I mentioned earlier, practicing outside in the heat with pads, weigh yourself in before and after practice, and then start to do it in games and see how much you lose. See how much weight you're losing. That is predominantly hydration and a little bit of stored muscle glycogen, but that starts to give you an idea of how much fluid you're losing when you train or practice. And then you're repleting, depending on the research that you follow, between 12 and 20 ounces per pound that you lose, over a period of time after the competition and games. And sometimes we can then use how much you're losing to influence how much fluid you should try to take in during the game, so that you're not losing quite as much. 2% loss in your body weight is dehydration. 1% loss is mild dehydration. And the impact of mild dehydration on performance is actually pretty significant. The first thing that goes when we're dehydrated is actually cognitive capabilities. So coordination and decision making. And so in a sport like hockey, where you're watching this like puck on the ice, I can't for the life of me understand how hockey players can see that puck moving so fast. And so, it's like baseball, watching seams on a baseball pitch. Like you have to be really dialed in. And so if you're dehydrated, it can change your reaction time to the puck, to a variety of different things. So staying hydrated is not just to prevent cramping. It's for you to stay on your A game mentally. And it's one of the first thing that goes when you're mildly or by definition, dehydrated. So I suggest that people don't just do it once, like do it a few times and see what your pattern is at practice and in games so that you can get an idea on how you should rehydrate. And then it can influence what you do in a game to know that, hey, I can't just drink water during the game. I need to have some electrolytes in this so this water sticks with me so I don't lose more than 2% body weight, during my match, if I can prevent it. Sometimes you can't prevent it. Race car drivers and people, it's just part of what happens. But there's, very strict rehydration protocols that they follow. And I think all athletes should, be paying attention to that.
No, I think that's fantastic advice in weighing yourself and understanding your individual needs from a sweat perspective. Because I can speak to some hockey players that I've worked with. For anyone who doesn't think hockey players sweat, even being in the gym with them, we got some severe sweaters, and you guys know who you are if you're listening to this. We actually there's a good point you made with the cognitive thing. We had an NHL athlete that worked with us last summer who's a goalie, and we were contacted by his NHL team because he was he sweat like profusely. Like I've never seen someone sweat even in the gym. And I can't
Mm,
imagine with him wearing hockey gear and doing 60 minutes of gameplay. They said there was times where he would lose like 10 to 15 pounds after a
wow.
game of just like sweat. Like he would be 10 or 15 pounds lighter because he sweat so much. And he was telling me that, like all the stuff they had him on, he was drinking pickle juice all day and he was trying everything he could. But he said the day after a game, I would quite literally wake up and feel like I was hungover. Like
Yeah,
he felt like he drank like 12 beers the night before because he was just so
yeah,
dehydrated and his head hurt.
yeah.
He had the headaches. And so I think that's a great point to know that like those cognitive abilities are going to go. And I don't think athletes are making that connection of that.
Mhm.
Like the mental aspect of any sport is a huge part, right? We all
Yeah.
understand the physical aspect of sport, but I don't think people on the outside looking in understand what the mental aspect of a sport and the cognitive abilities to make decisions and those quick decision making skills all come from, like you said, being hydrated. So I think that's a great point to understand your body and understand how you need to rehydrate for yourself. Like anything we've just talked about, it's all individual to yourself. So understanding yourself.
It's
Um,
really important really quick for the student athletes because you're in school all day and being dehydrated impacts your ability to pay attention at school. I mean, I can't tell
right.
you how many student athletes I've worked with where the benefit they get from being hydrated, they first notice in class. Like they're not so groggy, they're not so tired, they feel like they can pay
Hmm.
attention a bit more. And so that's really important too, because athletes are people first and student athletes are people and students first. And the athlete is the last important thing, although it's oftentimes the
Right.
first important thing we think of. But they're in class, they're supposed to be learning, that nourishment and hydration for the brain is critically important. So it has lots of benefits outside of performance as well.
No, that's a great point. And like to your point, even for myself, I know I try to get like a liter of water in before I go to the gym in the morning. I usually train in the mornings,
Mhm,
relatively early to me waking up. So I get some fruit in and try to get about a liter of water in. I definitely try to get a liter of water in before I even touch my coffee. But
mhm.
I've noticed in the days where I don't have time or work's crazy busy and I don't get to hydrate as much as I would like to, I do notice like after lunch I seem to crash, right?
Yeah,
Cognitively, I'm not there. I'm super sleepy. I need a nap. And I do notice that if I'm just putting more water in me throughout the day and making sure I'm taking care of those electrolytes, that I'm fresher. So that's actually a great point. I never even thought about that.
yeah. And a
Um,
cheap, really quick, a cheap tool. So the way in, way out we talked about, but another cheap tool is just to look at the color of your urine. Our urine should look like a light yellow color. It's not supposed to be clear all the time. If you just took in a bunch of water to rehydrate yourself, after a game for a few hours, it might get clear, but it's not supposed to be clear all the time. It's like a light lemonade color. The darker it gets, darker yellow, orangey tinge, that's a sign that you're light on your fluids and you need to bump them up. The darkest your time of the day when your urine will be the darkest is usually like your first morning urine because you haven't usually had fluids all night long. So it's a bit more concentrated. And then it should lighten up as the day goes on. And then if you had like 2 or 3 hours of training, and you didn't drink a lot, it might be a little darker after that. But in the States, a lot of college football programs will have these urine color charts in the restrooms to just remind their athletes to just, hey, like take a look, see where you're at with your color. And just, it's not a foolproof method, but it certainly is a way that's easy to just kind of see where you're at throughout the day and from day to day.
no, that's a great point. And I think like to your point, football does a great job with this. I know any football teams I've worked with have like the color charts like in the
Mhm.
restroom or in the locker room. That's like if your urine looks like this, you're already dehydrated. Get some fluid in you.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
hockey doesn't do a great job of that from my perspective, at least the teams I've worked with. But I think that's a great point. And just coming back to knowing your body, like everything that we've talked about is individual, and you have to know how you respond and how you perform based on like your fluid intakes, right? And so knowing yourself is the starting point to all of this. I want to
Mhm.
touch on, so we've touched on pregame, intragame. Let's talk about postgame and how athletes can start that recovery process postgame. What are the nutrients we're looking for postgame to start that recovery process, and when should you be trying to consume them timing wise?
Yeah. So the predominant macronutrients we want in a post-game setting is carbohydrates and protein. I mean, again, how much of both is going to depend on a few things, but I'd say on average, the literature says in the 3-to-1 ratio. So 3 times as many grams of carbohydrates to protein. Again, it could be a lot more than that, depending on how long the bout of exercise or training you did just was, or it could be more like a 1-to-1 if, it was just like a solid training session and you're not training again for a couple days. when it happens, or a little bit of an influence of how much carbohydrate in it, has to do with when are you training or competing again. So if someone's training or competing again that same day, you know, it's a track meet, it's a swim meet, it's a you know, maybe it's a baseball tournament, a soccer tournament or something, there's a game in the morning and a game at night, or hockey, then the quicker the better. Because again, now if we think of this gas tank model, we spent all of our gas and we have another, you know, 100 miles to drive in 4 hours. So the quicker we get that in the system, the better. The quicker we get our glycogen repleted, the better. So that now we're getting maybe some repair tools in from the amino acids and protein, but the carbohydrate replacement for glycogen, which is our primary energy source, is key and fundamental if there's another training or game in the same day. So the timing oftentimes is dictated on when's the next performance and or what's your goal. If I'm working with an athlete in the off season that's trying to add mass, then usually we have multiple times throughout the day we need to eat to get a caloric surplus and all the macros in we need. And so we're eating closer to the end of training and competition, only just so that we can eat again in like 3 hours. You know,
Right.
there's this tenant in performance nutrition, you have to eat within an hour afterwards, or else, you know, everything goes to hell in a handbasket. And there may be some truth to that in certain situations. And for some people, it might not be necessary. You just need to, in the next 2 to 3 hours, get a solid meal in with decent amount of protein and carbohydrates. And for some, you need to get it in right away because it's an injury situation. There's another game tomorrow. You're trying to add weight, you know, so the goal dictates a little bit the timing, and then of course is going to dictate the ratio of carbohydrates to protein. So there's some wiggle room within all of that, but I'd say the data probably would support a 3-to-1 carb to protein ratio for most people. And then again, the timing, it's nice to get it in 1 to 2 hours afterwards, probably on average for most athletes. I'd again keep it closer to the end if we're trying to add weight or there's another competition coming soon. And you know, just because I know we have another feeding, we might need to either get in 3 hours, or it's game time again. I'm trying to get that stuff down through digestion, so we can use it for energy soon.
Right. No, I love that. And like you said, it's context dependent, goal dependent on what you want to do. And I think a good point that you mentioned there is like not worrying so much about the timing. Like obviously, if you can make it perfect, then make it perfect. It's perfect for your goals, whatever that means for you. But I think a lot of times, like, and I'm certainly guilty of this when I first started training, of being so like neurotic about getting my protein shake in quote unquote the anabolic window that you hear in bodybuilding so much, right? And just like making sure that you get that stuff in. And in reality, I think the stress of like if you didn't have your protein shake is probably hurting your digestion more than if you just didn't have it. You know what I mean? So I think that's a good point.
What the performance nutrition science would support, that if someone's like trying to make gains and trying to recover well, or trying to add mass, make gains, the bigger, most important thing is that the whole day's worth of macros got in, that you hit your protein allotment for the whole day. Would we love it in that post anabolic window? And is there some benefit from muscle protein synthesis and glycogen repletion, all that? There is, but if you nailed your protein shake, but the rest of the day's food was garbage, then we're not going to make gains. And so that's where some people get a little too wrapped up. They're like, okay, I got my post workout shake in, had banana, had carbs, but they didn't eat breakfast. They didn't eat before they trained. They had a crap dinner. They, studied during lunch instead of eating. And so it's like, well, what was the point? So we get hyper focused sometimes on these little tenets when we have to kind of take sometimes a more 30,000-foot view. Is a post-game meal or shake or something helpful for a lot of people? Absolutely. But by itself, it's not going to get the job done. We need all the things for the whole day repeated over time as consistently as possible, especially for trying to add mass to make gains.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to your point, I think people do get caught up a little bit too much in the micro versus just zooming out a little bit and understanding that eating what you need to on the day-to-day basis and then being consistent on that over the week. It's the same thing when you're talking strength and conditioning. People get too wrapped up in like, what's the best exercise for this? And it's like just training the stimulus. The exercise isn't really that important. It's getting the stimulus and then doing it again tomorrow and then the next day, right? And just stacking those wins on top of each other. So I think there's so many parallels to be had between the performance and the nutrition performance. I want to be really conscious of your time here because I know you gotta jet real quick. Last thing I want to talk about is supplements. Do you recommend them to your athletes? And if so, what kinds of supplements are you recommending?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of supplements. Everybody that works with me takes vitamins, under the context of the fact that they have to be the right one. So first things first, no exceptions to the rule. They can only take things that are tested free of banned substances. The gold
Right.
standard in the States and to some extent probably in Canada is NSF certified for sport. There's more globally recognized organizations like Informed Choice and Informed Sport, but no one takes anything. I don't care if it's a multivitamin or fish oil, vitamin D, a protein powder, aminos, creatine, unless it's tested free of banned substances. That has to be there first. I don't care if you're a 13-year-old swimmer, a pro hockey player, I don't care what level you are, we have to hold that true, because there's too much at risk, even for just the growth and development of a student athlete, to be on something that might potentially have a stimulant or, excuse me, a hormone analog, some of the stuff that's banned substances. The New England Journal of Medicine, just a few years ago, tested 24 multivitamins off the counter in conjunction with NSF, and half of them failed for banned substances,
Oh,
over the
wow.
counter multivitamins. And so we think that, oh, banned substances might only be like in a pre workout, a weight gainer, an energy type product, but it can be in anything. And they're not always put there intentionally by the manufacturer of the supplements. They're oftentimes just in there by ignorance because the supplement manufacturer doesn't have good manufacturing practices and they don't know how to do all the things you need to do to keep a product clean, if you will. So NSF or Informed Choice or Informed Sport are the third party kind of best in class entities that will test a product for banned substances. Now, it doesn't mean once it's tested and stamped that it's a good product, because they don't really care about artificial colors and flavors. They're not checking the dose. They're going to make sure, hey, if you said this has 1,000 IU's of vitamin D, that it has that. But they're not going to say, well, is the 1,000 IU's the right dose? Should it be more? Should it be less? They're not taking a clinical approach to the dosing. They're just going to check label claim. So there's more to it than the banned substance testing. There's more you need to know about the rest of the ingredients and the other ingredients. So that's kind of how you first should start picking product. I'm a huge fan of supplements for a variety of reasons. The foundational stuff I give to everybody, multi-magnesium, vitamin D, fish oil. Over 75% of the US and Canadian population is deficient in magnesium, and vitamin D is almost parallel to that. Most people aren't eating 2 servings of cold water fatty fish per week, which is the American Heart Association's recommendation. So we're using new supplements and the micronutrients, macronutrients, essential fatty acids to just fill gaps that we're not getting in the diet. And even if an athlete is eating well, the demand of their sport, especially if they're a bigger body weight athlete, demands that they need more nutrition than more micronutrients, more essential fatty acids for inflammatory support, more vitamin D for immune support and recovery than what's in their food. And so I'm a big fan of multivitamin, fish oil, magnesium, vitamin D, basically for everybody, general population, student athlete, elite level athlete. And then what they take on top of that, it's going to be goal specific. I'd say if I was going to give the 2 things that most of my athletes are taking on top of that, it would be electrolytes, which we've talked a ton about, in a powdered form, not usually in a sports drink, but some sort of powdered form so I can titrate.
Okay.
Because there's some that have more sodium, some that have less. So once we figure out their sweat rate, what kind of sweater they are, then we can pick amongst those. And then collagen. I'm a big fan of collagen because of the white tissue in the body, ligaments, tendons, fascia, and the strain and stress that training and competition in every sport puts on joints. And just what it means to be an athlete these days is not what it meant to be an athlete when I was growing up. There's, every day of the week, athletes are doing something: practice, skill training, rehab, strength and conditioning. And so the joints just need some love. And we aren't getting enough of that collagen rich tissue or that collagenous type tissue in our diet to oftentimes keep the collagen rich tissue nourished enough. And so I'm a big fan of supplemental collagen. It has to be the right, can't be any collagen. I use one that's really well researched to help with bone strength and fracture risk, and it's been shown in athletes to help reduce like pain and soreness and help with tendon and ligament health. And so I'm a big fan of supplemental collagen, electrolytes, and just the foundational. I have a packet that I use with my athletes that has multi-fish oil, magnesium, vitamin D. And then after that, again, it's going to depend on what else is going on with them. We need stuff for sleep. How's their gut health? Are we trying to add mass? Is there some supplemental support we need to add for that? Are they in a post-injury state? And so we want to use some key nutrients to support healthy inflammatory response. So it's a bit customized after those three things.
No, I think that's awesome. I think there's a ton to take away for listeners there on what you recommended. And I think what it comes back to, like you said, it's about supplements are about filling the gap. I think a lot of people use supplements as kind of a crutch to not eat properly. And it's back to the fundamentals and filling the gap. So fundamentals being make sure you're eating properly first, and then use your supplements to handle those micronutrient needs, because I think macronutrients get a lot of the love most of the time, and people forget about the micronutrients. So I love that list. The last question I have for you, Jill, it's a closing tradition on this podcast, and it comes from the adage of you're the average of the 5 people you hang around with. In the digital world, that can be extrapolated out into you're the average of the 5 people you consume content from, the 5 people you take advice from, and so on. So I'm interested to know who those people are for you, who've influenced you both professionally, who you lean on to take advice from in your professional life, who've influenced you in the sport nutrition world.
That's such a good question. I love that quote. That's an adage and a quote that I myself, consider highly in my career and for a really long time. So I'm very intentional about the type of people I take advice from, or the type of people I pay to be my coach. Very, very intentional. They have to align with my values, like personal values. They have to embody like something that I would want, or that I would energetically just kind of want even in my own life. And so I have business coaches that I employ just to help me stay on task or help me finish projects when I have kind of a new thing that I'm working on. And I have longtime colleagues that are like functional and integrative nutrition people who've taught me just kind of the ropes, 20 years ago, and even taught me how to run a business. A lot of us get into this as coaches and professionals, but we didn't go to business school. So we don't know how to set up a business, run a business, we don't know how to do all these things. So a lot of the people who have been key people for me are people that have taught me that stuff that I didn't know, or people that champion me. Like I mentioned in the beginning, a big component of what I do is just championing the people, or being a champion of people, because that was like such a key component and still is of my success. So most of the people that I hire these days to coach me are strictly there to be a champion of me getting to the next level. So I have a dear colleague, friend, and mentor whose name is Chris Smith. He's the founder of a business called The Possibility Company, and he is just an amazing champion of people, and has been a key component of a lot of the things that I come out with in my business. I have a dear longtime colleague and nutrition friend who is a personal trainer, an amazing integrative nutritionist by the name of JJ Virgin, who has a huge brand in the States, and really has been key to teaching a lot of coaches and nutrition pros in the States just how to run a business and make a living out of doing what you love. And so I learned from her, 20 years ago how to do that. And I'm forever thankful. I follow a lot of researchers and experts in the industry on social media. I don't know them personally, but I would say that I there are a few that I feel like consistently are putting out decent work. There's a gentleman in the UK by the name of Laurent Bannock. He has a podcast and a social following. And one thing I've loved about him, that was something that I really honestly was disappointed about when I got into the sports nutrition field over 15 years ago, is that there was this disconnect between everybody being so dead set on only doing what the research said, but none of them are actually working a lot with people. And so it was like, yeah, this is what the research said, but this isn't really what's happening with the people you work with. There was like this disconnect. And I still think that happens a lot in our industry. But he always has been good about the translation of the fact that, hey, there's research and then there's the real world. And sometimes they cross over and sometimes they don't. And sometimes the real world should influence research and sometimes vice versa. So I find most of his podcasts and the things he puts out to be pretty accurate. There aren't a lot of integrative trained nutrition pros. A lot of people who approach performance from a wellness standpoint. That's been a growing field in the last 5 years, but that's how I've done business for the last 15. And so I'd love to see more people, although there's not enough talking about athlete health and wellness and what do we know about the athlete's gut. And there's a few, but there's not enough. I love Mark Bubbs. He's a guy that's up there in Canada. So he wrote a great book called Peak. And so I think the things he puts out are great. Again, I don't know him personally, but more of an integrated approach to performance. which I respect and align with, because that's how I've been doing business.
No, I love that, and I think that's a great list. And I got a nice book rec in there, so I'll be checking that book out for sure. Jill, I want to thank you so much for your time. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. There's a ton of nuggets in there for coaches, or for athletes and coaches, and I think you're very knowledgeable. And we didn't get to a lot of the things that maybe we wanted to talk to. Your knowledge really showed through, and I'd love to dig a little bit deeper. So we'll have to run it back again sometime. For the people who don't know about you, want to find out more about you, find out how to work with you, where can we send them?
Yeah, you can find me right now on Instagram at Team Fueling Champions. Well, my handle is going to change in a few weeks, but at Team Fueling Champions, or just go to my website, jilllane.com. If you work with student athletes, or if you're a parent of student athletes listening, I have just like a free nutrition starter kit there meant for families and student athletes. That's like a passion project of mine. And so feel free to grab that and just nose around to what I have going on there. And then, yeah, connect with me on Instagram.
Awesome. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Jill. You've been very generous with your time. And like I say, we'll have to run this one back sometime.
Yeah, I've had a ton of fun. I appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one.
Awesome.